those were an interesting little tidbit. They look like, with all the age on them, they look like they have been around forever. And in some regards, they have. In 1988, the Corps of Engineers out at the Moose Creek Dam, they had put in the dam project out there, okay? They put in the dam project and they had these gates out there. Somewhere, somebody in the engineering department that set this whole idea up wasn't really doing real engineering. So what they did, because they wanted to keep the ice from being a problem on the gates, was they filled them full of spray foam. And then they made sure, since they put foam in there, that it was all sealed up. So now, in case nobody had thought about it, we now have a steel boat instead of a floodgate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would happen, this was part of the winch gear that lowered it. I've actually got, that's another one up there. I picked these up from a couple different places. These were the last ones I got. But anyway, they basically never got used because they didn't work. And they looked so pretty when I first looked at them, because when I first looked at them, we got the job to do retrofit on those gates. And we set them up so that they had hydraulic cylinders that pushed down. And now they had already been using these, I think they had been using them for 5 years. It was either 5 or 10 years, but they'd been using them like they were, because they had to use them for that long before they could put out a contract to do updates that didn't just say, oops, we were stupid. If they had ones that said, oops, we're stupid, somebody has to get fired. So instead, I've seen this with a lot of, even with business too, where you got to use something for a while before you get rid of it when it's wrong. In fact, my man lift in the shop was a similar one to that. That's why it was a no-time man lift that was up for auction. But that's another story. When we get to the man lift, we'll talk about that one. When we get to the one that's in the shop. Anyway, what they were doing, and oh Lord, if a guy only had this contract, you couldn't beat it. What they did, because most of the time, the gates were in the down position. So, you know, at least some of them. So for each of the gates, when it went down, they were hiring 24/7 people with excavators to go on the roadway on top of the gate and push down with an excavator so that they could get enough weight to actually close the dam. They were hiring, and I talked to some of the people later on that had those contracts, and they were like, yeah, that was great. So 24/7 for 5 or 10 years. It's not your tax money. The government stole it fair and square. Once they stole it, they can blow it however they want. The thing we need to do is keep them from stealing it. But that's on my different point of view, not my mechanical point of view. Mechanical point, okay, they made a boo-boo. There was 2 different points that we had in the contract. The first point was we had to take these gates. They were so convinced at this point that we had to make these gates not float, that not only did we have to open up the gates, take the panels off, but we had to replace them with stainless steel screens so that water could go in and out without filling up with rocks. And another thing, when we did that, we had to do it without using heat, because they were afraid somebody might 30 years later might give them some kind of a liability claim against getting sick off of the spray foam that was in there if any of it caught fire. So I built a machine that was a portable milling machine that would go down 22 foot of track, and I think we were about 6 inches per minute that it was milling, and it would mill out a weld. We were using cutters between 7/8 and 1 1/8 wide that would run down this track I made and mill out the weld, and then that would let us remove the plate. But since I'd made this this track system that went down and followed the contour and milled out the weld, when we got done, we also had a whole bunch of 1/2-inch plate that was reusable. So we took the 1/2-inch plate that came off of there, we sandblasted it, and for miners and people, we had these big sheets of 1/2-inch plate for sale. So the shop I was working at resold the plate, We did the 2.3 million job, I think it was, for cutting the plates off and scooping out the foam, putting on the new deck plates and screens to let water in and out so that they would sink. Then, this is where it gets really stupid. Then on top of that, they decided that they needed to put 14-inch bore hydraulic cylinders to push them down, to make sure that they would go down. So not only do we make them so they're now heavy, but we put hydraulic cylinders to raise them up and down, instead of just using the electric powered winch gear they had already bought. That was beautiful. You could look at it. It was sitting there with the switch gear, all the, oh, they were absolutely beautiful. And when I saw them, I was like, ooh, we could make something good out of this stuff. Well, I haven't made anything good out of them, but I did end up with them, and they don't look as pretty anymore. But they had them sitting there. They had spare gearboxes sitting there. I think there were 5 gates and then a spare for everything, but I'm not sure. Anyway, there were several of them. I think I have 4 or 5 of these gearboxes now. Anyway, that's what those were about, was to raise up the floating gate, which didn't go down. And why I ended up there and got to see how it was actually put in, I knew that it was raised with a winch and they wanted to go to the cylinders. And it was when I actually looked at it that I was like, oh, it's just a shame they didn't just use the winch gear, because it would have worked great once we modified them. Anyway, the hydraulic cylinders didn't clear part of the structure inside of the dam gates because the manufacturer of the cylinder didn't clock the head directly at 90 degrees. It was a square head, and it was going through a relatively square opening. They had it off about 20 degrees, and so it was wanting to cut part of the corners. Again, they didn't want certain things, so we couldn't go out there with a disc grinder. My suggestion was, well, let's just go out there with a torch and a disc grinder, knock the corners off, everybody will be happy. No, we had to set up a portable milling machine that clamped onto the cylinders, so we made all the framework and stuff for this so that we could mill the 4 corners off to where they were clipping things. And that was when I got to see the winch gear for the first time, and then, 30 years later I started ending up with it, or nearly 30 years.